Hi, friends. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to APS Stamp Chat. We're so happy to have you. We'll wait a few moments at this top of the 3 o'clock hour and wait for our friends to join in. Please, friends, just a little plug. Today, it marks the last day of the VSS 2020 code, which is our special membership code for the APS. You can get membership till December 31st, 2021. If you sign up now on stamps.org/join now using the coupon code VSS 2020, that gets you membership till December 31st, 2021, and that ends today. And thank you so much for joining us, friends. We're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Heidi Rhodes, and welcome to APS Stamp Chat. Our Stamp Chat guest is Mr. Henry Jehan. Henry has been a stamp collector for 63 years. He began when he was 10 years old, when his grandfather gave him a shoebox full of old US stamps he had accumulated in the early 1900s when working in the mailroom at Winchester Firearms. Over the years, Henry's interests have expanded to include the stamps of Canada, Great Britain, British Europe, and British Oceania. But the heart of his stamp collecting interest has remained with his US collection. In 1963, Henry was a high school student taking classes in physics when he learned of an experiment being run by the Department of the Post Office. They were printing stamps with special ink that would glow under specific frequencies of ultraviolet light. He saw this as a perfect melding of his studies and his hobby, sparking his lifetime interest in the luminescent tagging of postage stamps from their very beginning. After earning a college degree in physics, Henry went on to a 31-year career as an Army civil servant in test and evaluation and the acquisition of military equipment. Now retired, he continues to be an avid collector, a member of the Central Florida Stamp Club in Orlando, Florida, and a member of the APS. Today's Stamp Chat is sponsored by the APS Membership Department. When you become a member of the American Philatelic Society, you join 134 years of fellowship in the hobby. Member benefits include a subscription to the American Philatelist, access to the American Philatelic Research Library, exclusive member-only content, and the ability to both sell and buy on Stamp Store. In addition to traditional memberships, the APS offers international and digital-only memberships. Visit stamps.org today. Now, before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items to take care of. Today's session is a webinar, and as such, all audio and video of attendees will be muted and turned off respectively throughout the presentation. Please feel free to use the chat box to engage with other attendees and the Q&A box for your questions for Mr. Jehan. This session is being recorded and will be made available on the APS YouTube channel. Today's presentation is pre-recorded. However, Mr. Jehan is with us live, and we will read to him as many of the questions as we receive in the Q&A box as time allows. And with that, we present
Alrighty, let's see if we can make it work this way. Today, I will be discussing luminescent tagging on United States postage stamps. Specifically, I will discuss why we have them, how they came about, and some of the technology related to their implementation. When we are talking about luminescent tagging on postage stamps, we are really talking about canceling stamps and sorting the mail. In the first 2/3 of the 20th century, these tasks were extremely labor-intensive. Automated canceling machines have been in use since the late 1800s, but in spite of numerous improvements as late as the 1950s, the canceling of stamps on the envelopes required as many as 6 people to feed a single canceling machine. The difficult task was facing the envelopes, the process of aligning them so that the envelope is addressed side up with the stamp in the upper right corner. The process was error-prone, resulting in many envelopes making more than one pass through the canceling machine. This particular slide shows just such an error, where it was canceled upside down and then passed through for a second pass. But miscanceling was not the only problem. In some cases, the stamp that came through wasn't a stamp at all. This envelope shows a Cinderella, specifically a Piggly Wiggly Greenbacks trading stamp that carried through as a regular postage stamp. In 1953, President Eisenhower's Postmaster General, Arthur Ellsworth Summerfield Jr., made the decision to improve and automate all facets of mail processing. This resulted in Project Turnkey to create the first automated post office. The principal components were provided by the Pitney Bowes Corporation and the National Cash Register Corporation, better known as NCR. The system integration was done by the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, also known as ITT. The opening of the first automated post office in Providence, Rhode Island, was commemorated with this stamp issued on October 20, 1960. As part of this effort, a machine was sought that would automatically face and cancel the letters. The post office solicited for this work, and prototypes were created and tested. By October 1957, the post office had made the decision to procure and install the Pitney Bowes Mark I facer canceller into postal facilities. In 1959, the Post Office Department also awarded its first volume order for mechanization to Pitney Bowes Incorporated for the production of 75 Mark II facer cancellers. The Pitney Bowes facer canceller used optical sensors detecting reflected light in the visible spectrum to identify the position of the stamp. The envelope was then mechanically flipped to align the stamp with the canceller. However, the process was prone to error from insufficient contrast between the stamp and the envelope, or the placement of stickers, such as Christmas seals, on the cover. The early machines had a high rejection rate of 12 to 14%. The cover in this photograph shows and illustrates such an error made by a Mark II facer canceller. In handling this cover, the Canadian Mark II facer canceller was fooled by the Christmas seals. The internet source for the photograph states that the 6-cent orange stamp was subsequently hand canceled with a pull-on roller. To address the rejection rate problem, Pitney Bowes and the National Cash Register Company undertook research to improve the stamp location detection process. This was a research efforts that they did independently. One of the early approaches was to augment or replace the visible light source with a long-wave ultraviolet UV light source. Because paper makers have been adding fluorescent whiteners to much of the paper used by the stationers, the approach did help the detection by improving the contrast between the stamp and the envelope, as shown in these examples. Using long-wave UV enhanced the detection of the stamp position on some envelopes with varying success because of non-uniform ink and paper characteristics. There are reports that experiments were done putting fluorescent compounds in the ink to use to print the stamp image. However, such printings did not result in any stamp variants listed in the standard catalogs, and I have not been able to detect fluorescing ink in any of the stamps from the 1950s and 1960s. Far more successful was the printing of the stamps on paper in which the manufacturers had added chemical optical brighteners, paper whiter. This became known as bright paper, and in 1958, the post office began using it in stamp production. Up until this time, paper brightness was measured on a scale developed by the General Electric Company in the 1930s. It was a scale designed to go with their brightness meter. However, it only assessed light reflectivity in the visible range. Because there was no industry standard and different manufacturers used different processes in creating the bright paper, there was no uniformity in the observed brightness. In his handbook on U.S. luminescent stamps, Alfred Borger identified 3 degrees of paper brightness, which he designated as low bright, medium bright, and high bright. The Bureau of Printing and Engraving did not have a history of managing paper types, especially managing them for a characteristic not visible to the naked eye. So as a result, some of the issues were printed on more than one type of paper. We had stamps printed on both high bright, medium bright, and low bright papers. The first bright new issue was the 25-cent Revere. That was a Scott 1048, issued on March 18, 1958. As the previously issued 3-cent Liberty, 4-cent Lincoln, 7-cent Wilson, and 20-cent Monticello stamps were all reprinted, these additional printings were produced on bright paper. These paper differences were not initially detected, and as a result, they do not show up as variants in the stamp catalogs. Because there was a slight change in the color of the ink, the bright version of the 10-cent Independence Hall, that's a Scott 1044B, is the only one of these reprints to be identified in the standard catalogs. The 4-cent Bolivar was the first of the 55 commemoratives, 13 new issue definitives, and 5 airmails that were printed on bright paper before its use was stopped on December 10, 1964. After the stop order, there were 7 additional commemorative issues that came out on bright paper in 1965. Since 1965, there have been no experimental printings on bright paper. However, the use of bright paper has become commonplace because of the insertion of brighteners has become a standard practice in paper production. For those of you who are looking at the current US stamps, you'll remember that last year's Golden Spike stamp was particularly beautiful, but it is printed on a very bright paper, and when you put it under long wave UV, it just brightens up and lights up amazingly. On the other hand, the post office mural stamp of last year was done on very dead paper and doesn't light up at all. There is a handout that goes with this presentation, which at some point is going to get posted out on the website so that you can download it, because we weren't able to make it happen in conjunction with the Zoom meeting. But the handout lists all the stamps that were printed on bright paper during the experimental period. The 4 stamps on this slide that you've been looking at, they were all issued in 1959 and illustrate the difference between dead and bright papers. In ambient visible light, they all look alike. But when we put them under the long wave UV, the differences between the 2 paper types become very apparent. You have the Arctic exploration and the American flag on a bright paper, where you have the Silver Centennial and the World Peace through World Trade are on dead paper. The 2 plate blocks on this slide appear to be identical. They are the same stamp with the same plate number and same plate position. However, they are actually quite different because they were printed on different lots of bright paper, as shown in the images illuminated with the long wave UV. And since the bright paper was not carefully managed by the printing office, that's why we get these deviations of the same stamp on different grades of paper. Well, the Pitney Bowes approach of using the bright paper didn't seem to pan out too well. But National Cash Register was working on a totally different approach. The National Cash Register approach to improving the reliability of stamp detection in the Mark II facer canceller was to modify the stamp by applying a taggant that was invisible to the unaided eye, but glowed under shortwave UV illumination. For the taggant, they chose to use an inorganic phosphorus compound that glowed when illuminated with a 2,537 angstrom light source. That's 253.7 nanometers for any of you who care about those things. By adjusting the composition of the phosphorus compound, they were able to create a taggant that glowed red-orange and a taggant that glowed blue-green. This allowed the tagging process to address 2 problems: locating the stamp in the facer canceller to ensure that it was being canceled, and separating airmail from surface mail, which was a huge problem for the post office in that time frame. The 8-cent capital airmail stamp, Scott C64, then currently in regular use, was selected to be coated with a taggant that glowed red-orange. The newly tagged stamps, designated Scott C64A, were issued on August 1st, 1963, for a limited citywide test in the Dayton, Ohio area, and are shown on this slide. Before I continue, I would like to draw your attention to the timeline on the left of this slide. It will appear in the next few slides as we walk through the various stamp issues. The tag stamps are listed in the order of their issue. Airmail stamps have their Scott numbers shown in red. Surface mail stamps have their Scott numbers shown in green. The stamps in bold are the issues specifically being addressed on the slide. At the right of this slide is the Post Office Department's official press release to announce the Phase 1 experiment. Since the text is small and I'm sure you can't read it, I will read it for you. It reads, all postal installations, 8-cent luminescent tagging airmail postage stamp. The current 8-cent airmail stamp will be used in the first field test of luminescent tagging to speed mail handling. A luminescent ink, which glows a reddish-orange color under ultraviolet light, will be overprinted on airmail stamps used in the field tests. This ink contains an invisible inorganic phosphor commonly used in creams, ointments, and medications. This stamp will be first placed on sale at Dayton, Ohio on August 1, 1963. During controlled field tests and until further notice, the tagged stamps will be utilized only at Dayton. They are interchangeable with untagged stamps for normal postal purposes. A small black box added to the Mark II facer canceling machine will recognize and separate specially treated airmail stamps in the field tests. The relatively inexpensive modification was conceived and developed by the Post Office Department research scientists working in conjunction with the National Cash Register Company, Dayton, Ohio, and climaxes experiments that have been ongoing for more than 3 years. The luminescent tagging of this airmail stamp represents not only a significant technological advance, but a first in U.S. postal history. The principles incorporated in this test will provide the Post Office Department with technical capabilities that offer great potential benefit to the mailing public in terms of dollar savings and improved service. Collectors desiring first-day cancellations may send addressed envelopes together with remittance to cover the cost of the stamps to be affixed to the Postmaster, Dayton, Ohio, 45401. See Postal Manual, Section 145.3. Mint stamps will be available at the Philatelic Sales Agency, Post Office Department, Washington, D.C., 20260 and on after August 2, 1963. Issued by the Special Assistant to the Postmaster General. First day of use, luminescent tagging was the wording on a special die hub attached to the modified facer canceller put in use on 1 August 1963, the first day of the experimental program. Here it was not the stamp being honored, but rather the new method to speed the flow of airmail letters that was on trial. The invisible tag activated ultraviolet sensors, which in turn separated the airmail from the regular letters, then faced the envelope and canceled the stamp. The Artcraft cover pictures the Mark II facer canceller. The lower cover is the first cover Borger prepared for capturing the first day of use, as he covered the story of the experimental introduction of luminescent tagging to the postal system. NCR created their own cover that celebrated their accomplishment and commemorated the true nature of the event. Both NCR and the Post Office Department workers soon noticed that many of the airmail letters were franked with regular postage stamps, and in some cases with older airmail issues. In order to rectify the situation, officials placed an order with the U.S. Printing Office for a supply of these airmail labels to be phosphor coated with the same ink as the 8-cent airmail issue. These tagged airmail labels were officially issued and played an important part in the initial test by ensuring all airmail was tagged before being sent through the facer canceller. According to Borger, during the initial test period, postal clerks all over the Dayton area placed these labels into the hands of patrons buying stamps or depositing airmail letters, and affixed one of these labels on all outgoing mail. Borger captured the first day of use for the tagged airmail etiquette with the cover above. Few, if any, covers illustrating the use of the etiquette on personal and business correspondence have survived with collectors, and most all have been presumably destroyed in use, which is kind of unusual because, according to Borger, these etiquettes were being passed out in the thousands and being stuck on everything going through the experiment. I have yet to find a cover that is from personal correspondence or business correspondence with the use of one of these etiquettes. So if you know of one, I would be most interested in seeing it or photographing it or even procuring it. On October 26, 1963, 2.5 months after the experimental program began in Dayton, the second tag stamp was issued in Washington, D.C. Tagged with a blue-green taggant, the 5-cent 100th anniversary of City Mail, that's a Scott 1238, was the first tagged commemorative stamp and the first stamp in which the entire issued quantity was to be tagged. The previous tagged stamp, being the 8-cent airmail, it had previously been issued untagged, so there was only a small portion of them that were tagged. Over time, the lacquer that was used to apply the taggant has yellowed, so the tagged area on the sheet can be seen with the naked eye. You can see that on this slide. If you look closely to at the picture from the ambient light, you can see that there's a yellow tint to it, but there's a whiter stripe across the bottom. When you look at the image on the right, you see that the area that has the yellow tint is the tagged area that lights up green, and that whiter stripe is not tagged, and so it makes the gray stripe under the UV light. The usual cover producers created covers commemorating the 100th anniversary of City Mail delivery. NCR created a cover that commemorated the technological innovation being brought about. And as might be expected, the first fully tagged issue created the first tagging error. Because the taggant is invisible in ambient light, some stamps were accidentally produced and issued without the tagging overprint. And here's an example of the tag stamp on the left and the untagged stamp on the right. The 1963 Christmas stamp was printed untagged on bright paper and also tagged. As a result, we have the tag stamp in ambient light shown on the left of this slide. We have the stamp under long wave UV at the center, and we have the tag stamp under the shortwave UV on the right. So you have the same stamp photographed under 3 different lighting conditions to give you 3 totally different images of what it is. The second stamp to be issued as tagged rather than as an overprint of an untagged issue was the 8-cent Goddard airmail. Issued on October 5, 1964, being an airmail, it was tagged in red-orange. Beginning with this issue, all subsequent airmail stamps were issued tagged. Like its surface mail predecessor, the 5-cent City Mail delivery, the 8-cent Goddard airmail stamp created the second tagging omitted error. Again, the usual cover providers created covers that ignored the tagging innovation, and special tagging covers were not produced by the by NCR for this particular issue. The experiment in Dayton continued on through 1964 and 1965. During this time, only one new tag stamp was issued, and that was the coil version of the 8-cent jet over the Capitol, which was the tagged 65A. At the end of 1965, and what must have been preparation for the second phase of the experimental program, the Department of the Post Office began issuing additional tag stamps beginning with the 1965 Christmas issue. A total of 9 definitive stamps already in use were overprinted with the blue-green taggant first used on the 100th anniversary of City Mail. The previously issued stamps that were overprinted are in the order of issue: the 4-cent Black Lincoln, the 5-cent Unshaven Washington, the 3-cent Statue of Liberty, the 10-cent Independence Hall, the 15-cent John Jay, the 1-cent Jackson, the 1-cent Jackson coil of 3,000, the 8-cent Albert Einstein, and the 5-cent flag over the White House. The second phase of the experimental stamp program officially started on May 19, 1966 in Cincinnati, Ohio. The plan was to saturate the tri-state area, Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, with tagged postage. This area accounted for about 12% of the national postage consumption, so the Bureau of Printing and Engraving was instructed to tag 12% of the 8 commemorative stamps, starting with the 5-cent National Park Service issue and continuing through the 5-cent Merry Cassette. And also that included the 5-cent Christmas stamp. So those were Scott numbers 1314 through 1322. Borger reports that for each of these issues, both the tagged and the untagged versions made their way randomly onto the first day covers. And you'll notice on this slide that we have a picture of a untagged stamp at the top and a tagged stamp at the bottom. They both are identical in that they carry the same plate number, and they're both, in this particular case, that's a photograph under the UV light, so you are seeing the untagged stamp at the top and the tagged stamp at the bottom. Otherwise, if you looked at them in ambient light, they look the same. The second phase of the experimental stamp tagging program was apparently successful because on April 17, 1967, the program went nationwide with the issuing of the 5-cent stamp commemorating the centennial of the National Grange. Beginning with this issue, all stamps have been issued as tagged, except Bureau pre-cancels and other special rate stamps. The untagged versions of the tag stamps beginning with the National Grange issue are considered errors. Now, I've got a second handout for you, and actually the 2 handouts are in the same file. The second handout lists all of the tagged stamps in the experimental period, starting with the 8-cent jet over the Capitol when it was tagged, up through the end of the experimental period with the National Grange issue, and lists them all in order. In his handbook on U.S. luminescent stamps, Borger tells us that on October 17, 1966, the Bureau of Printing and Engraving began production on an order of 3-cent Statue of Liberty stamps in coils of 3,000. The order was prepared for Look magazine, which is why the printing became known as the Look coil. Type 2 tagging was used in the manufacture of these stamps, which resulted in their having a very uniform and bright application of the taggant. So what you have at the top is the Look coil in ambient light and the Look coil under the UV. The Look coil stamps were not recognized by the Post Office Department as philatelically significant at the time of their printing. The fact that this printing was the first tagged production of 3-cent Statue of Liberty coil went unnoticed, and it wasn't until April 1967 when the philatelic community discovered their existence. At that time of discovery, the Post Office Department withdrew 32 coils of the 3,000 stamp rolls for philatelic sales, but they sold out very quickly. The Post Office Department placed an order to print an additional quantity. But when the order was executed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing on June 14, 1967, the result was the creation of a new stamp. The reprints were produced in coils of 500. The reprints have a sharper and more defined image in the visible light, a more intense shade of purple ink in the visible light, and a slightly fluorescent bright paper. The tagging is less intense and some of the stamps have across the web marks in the tagging, often called hot lines, which repeat every 24 stamps. So you can see that under the UV, there's a significant difference in how these appear. The Disabled Veterans of America was an early adopter of the use of postage stamps to frank direct mail solicitations. DAV preferred to use low denomination multiples whenever possible to make up the first class postage rate. In 1968, with the first class rate at 6 cents, the Cincinnati postmaster ordered 2-cent Jefferson coils for a planned DAV mailing. Each envelope, both the transmittal and return envelopes, would be franked with 3 of these 2-cent coils to meet the 6-cent first class rate. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing printed this order, applied overall tagging on the letterpress station of the Cottrell Press, and finished it in rolls of 3,000 stamps. The bulk of this printing order was sent to Cincinnati, with a portion sent to the Philatelic Sales Unit. The date of issue is given as May 6, 1968, and this was the first tagged 2-cent stamp, and that is shown at the top of this slide. A planned second printing of the tagged 2-cent Jefferson coil was issued in April 10, 1971. This issue was finished in rolls of 500 stamps. Collectors eventually noted that these stamps appeared to be different from the 1968 printings in regard to ink and paper. Moreover, tagging specialists found the tagging on the second printing to be dull and grainy, with hot lines found on some of the coils. The hot line is identified in that lower picture as a taggant joint line. The tagging on the first printing was bright and clear. However, unlike the tagged 3-cent Statue of Liberty coil, the second printing never received a unique catalog number. In 1974, there was a third printing. It was very similar to the second printing without any documented identifying differences from the second printing. Both the 1968 and 1971 printings of this coil are dry printings from the 432 subject plates and finished with small perforation holes. The second printing is a visually clearer print. The sharpness of the line is distinctive and gives the stamp a slightly darker shade of carmine rose. The gum on that printing is white. That of the first printing has a more yellow tone to it. Some dealers call it brown gum. And Chown and Newhart, they did some experiments on it and note that there is no discernible difference in the paper color, texture, or thickness. In 1968, the tagging was type 2 and is visibly different from the 1971 tagging, which is type 3. Faintly present in the image above, the type 3 application produced the gap lines and hot lines discovered by earlier specialists, as identified as the joint line. And it's interesting that the Look coil and the Jefferson coil went through very similar stories and came out with a similar documented situation with the stamp community, or philatelic community, even though their circumstances were quite similar. They had a different outcome. The tagged postal stationery on August 15, 1967, the 5-cent embossed stamped envelope and the 8-cent embossed stamped airmail envelope were reissued as tagged. Rather than overprinting the vignette as was done on the tagged stamps, the post office chose to print a rectangle of the taggant to the left of the embossed image. This tagging configuration was given the name glow bar and has become the most commonly used method for tagging postal stationery. Airmail, as a distinct service, was effectively ended within the United States on October 10, 1975, when all domestic inner-city first-class mails began to be transported by air wherever practical and or expeditious at the normal first-class rate. Domestic airmail, as a separate class of service, and its rate structure was formally eliminated by the successor to the Post Office Department, the United States Postal Service, on May 1, 1977. This eliminated the need to separate domestic airmail from domestic surface mail and eliminated the need and purpose for the orange-red tagging of airmail stamps. The last two airmail stamps tagged in orange-red were the Scott C89 and C90, both issued in Honolulu, Hawaii on January 2, 1976. The first two airmail stamps tagged in bluish-green were Scott C91 and C92, issued in Dayton, Ohio on September 23, 1978. The technology of applying the tagging has evolved over this time period. It started out with very rudimentary, got to get it done type of work being done when they first tagged the plane over the Capitol airmail, and enhanced over time. The four basic categories of tagged stamps are overall tagging, block tagging, phosphored ink, and pre-phosphored paper. What we've been talking about so far has been overall tagging. All these experimental stamps had tagging applied in different means over the entire stamp. Block tagging came about later, in which the tag applied to the stamp made a rectangular block that only covered the vignette and did not cover the perforation margin of the stamp. Using phosphored ink was an experiment that was done several times to try and see if they could simplify the printing process. And putting the phosphor into the paper was also experimented with so that they wouldn't have to apply the tagging as an overprint on the stamps. These tagging technologies are all going to be addressed in detail in our next chat. Stamps that Glow, Luminescent Tagging on United States Stamps, Part 2, Evolution of the Technology, which will be next week, same time, same place. Before I wrap up, though, I really need to express that we owe a great debt of gratitude to Mr. Alfred G. Tag Borger. Tag, as he became known, was a newspaper reporter and stamp collector in Toledo, Ohio. He is the one who chronicled the tagging experiment in Dayton and subsequently the tri-state experiment. In doing this, he collected much of the early material, created first day covers for the various issues, and became a dealer specializing in tagged material. His handbook on U.S. luminescent stamps, shown here, is still, to my knowledge, the principal reference available on this subject. Any questions? And with that, I guess I need to stop sharing my screen.
Well, I would keep that available, Mr. Jehan, just in case we need to slide through. But thank you so much for that presentation. And we have several questions, so why don't we get started? And friends, go ahead and use that Q&A box, please, to send your questions to Mr. Jehan. Okay, first question. Were the tagged airmail etiquettes used in Dayton before the 8/1/64 8-cent capital airmail release?
The answer is no. If we go, let me go back to that slide. I have a slide here of Borger. It appears that they were the first use was actually on 28 October 63, which is what Borger attempted to capture with this, because he took the untagged Amelia Earhart and the etiquette and put it on the envelope and got them run through the machine for cancellation. But there was no real first day of issue done. Because what happened is that the tagged stamps were put on sale and put in use on 1 August of 63. And they realized over the month of August and September they had a problem. So they did this hurry up order to get them printed sometime apparently in September. I don't know the exact date. And they got them in, and so then on 28 October, they started handing them out. And that's why Borger created this cover. So this is effectively the first day cover for the use of that tagged etiquette. And they continue to use them for a long time. You can find covers that Borger had put this etiquette on that are as many as 10 years later. So there's a lot of them out there.
Why did the NCR first day of use cover receive a hand cancel? Was a concession to NCR? Was this a concession to NCR or just happenstance?
I think it was a concession. I think well, I don't know. And I don't know, is that truly a, let me back up and look at the other ones. Yeah, the other ones are clearly, well, the one that came through from Borger clearly looks like it was done by the machine, but the one that was done on the Artcraft cover actually looks like it is somewhat different, just slightly different than the one that was done on Borger's. So it's quite possible that because of the sheer volume, they were doing them by hand and doing them through the machine. I don't know. That's a good question.
That's what happens when you're a guest on Stamp Chat, full of good questions.
Yes.
So here's our another question from one of our attendees. Can you share with us the tools you use for viewing tagging and under what viewing conditions, dark, etc., that we can best observe tagging clearly?
All righty. I don't have them handy to hold them up and show you, but when I started this, there were no UV lights available. You couldn't go out to a stamp supply place and get a UV light to look at your stamps. So the closest thing I could do was go to a rock hound supply place, because people who worked in mines and were into looking for various rocks used UV lamps to identify the fluorescence in the rocks and minerals. And I special ordered a light that was specifically set to the wavelength of the new tagged stamps, which was specifically a 2,537 angstrom notch filter on this lamp. And it has been absolutely fabulous, and it's been my gold standard for looking at US tag stamps. Unfortunately, as the rest of the world adopted some of this, other countries didn't stick to 2,537 angstroms as their target frequency. And so sometimes my light will not light up the tag stuff from other countries. So I had to go to another lighting source. But that is a plug in the wall kind of light. It's not very bright. So I find that to see the tagging most clearly, I have to put myself in a totally dark room. Quite often I sit we have a walk-in closet, and quite often I sit in the walk-in closet and with my light, because I keep the door closed and it's dark in there. There are a lot of different lights that have come out since then, and some of them are quite expensive, but from what I understand from others, they work very well. I did get one of those battery operated multifunction ones that gives you the long wave and the short wave on the same device. And that was kind of a disaster. It worked for a while, but didn't last long. And the biggest problem was batteries. So I've gotten a new one. The new one I've gotten it's a Chinese manufactured device. It's shortwave only. It's red in color. It takes 4 AA batteries, and it works great. It's just because of my previous problem with batteries, every time I use it, I take the batteries out of it when I'm done. But it lights really well, and it provides a broad scope of light that lights up the stamps well without having, matter of fact, it'll even work pretty well in some ambient light, and as opposed to being hiding in the closet. And it also will light up a lot of the foreign stamps because it has a much wider band of shortwave UV than my notched filtered one. For looking at the long wave stuff, if you remember, if you're old enough to remember, back in the 70s, there was quite a fad about having everything light up UV. We went to nightclubs and dance halls and places, and everything was lit up in long wave UV light. And posters were made that way. And they made lamps, a fluorescent lamp that was UV, that was designed to go at the base of your poster to light up your poster on the wall. And somewhere along the way, I acquired one of those, and I found that it works really great for my stamps. So I use that for doing the long wave stuff. And because it's designed to light a large area, it'll light up the whole table. It's quite effective. So that's kind of what I've been doing, but there's newer and better stuff out there than what I've been using.
And to that, dangerous to your eyes? We have someone asking.
Yes, a matter of fact, I'm going to give you this warning on the next show, but next time we talk. But I'm going to go ahead and bring it up today. Now there's your warning. It says, never look directly into the light emitted by a UV lamp. Direct exposure to UV light, particularly shortwave UV, which is UVB. You know, you hear about the protectors for UVA and UVB. Long wave is UVA, short wave is UVB. And UVB will do permanent damage to your eyes if you look directly into it. So when working with a UV light source, you should always wear glasses containing a UV blocker. I wear regular corrective lenses, and they have the UV in them, the UV blocker in them, so I don't have a problem with that. They make clear UV blocking clear sunglasses. You can wear them. Now, the light emitted by the stamps when illuminated by the UV light is eye safe. The problem is just the light source itself. So as long as you're aiming the light source down on the stamp and looking at the light that's being emitted by the stamp, you're good. If you're wearing the UV blocker in your glasses, then even if you accidentally knock the lamp over or look at it or wave it over your eyes, you're good. But you also need to be careful that when you're using it, you don't allow the UV light to reflect off of stamp mounts or mirror surfaces or things of that sort, because that would put it back in your eyes if your eyes aren't covered with a protective lens of some sort. We'll talk about this again in the next stamp chat.
Excellent. And there have been several questions regarding that, friends. And just so you are aware, one registration does get you into all three presentations. So the fact that you are here automatically registered you for talks 2 and 3 forthcoming. Next question, sir. How does the gummed side vary in color? Tagged versus no tag, and bright versus dead paper? Thanks.
All righty. The taggant on these this experimental period was applied purely to the face side, so you don't get taggant in the gum. There is one exception called the tap stamps, which I'm gonna defer talking about until our next session. But generally speaking, from the gum side, you're not going to see any difference between a tag stamp and an untagged stamp. And if it's a used stamp that you've soaked off of an envelope or such, you're not going to see anything at all related to the taggant on the back. So that's kind of the general answer. There are a couple of quirky things but I'll be talking specifically about in our next presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Jehan. Next question. And there are just so many. Is there any distinction made of fluorescent versus phosphorescent dyes used in tagging?
Okay. That gets to the basic question. What's the difference between luminescent and phosphorescent? The general category for all of this is called fluorescent. And fluorescence is the emission of light by a material that has been activated by an exciter. We see fluorescent lights, these tube lighting, all the time, where what we have is electricity as the exciter, exciting a mercury vapor in the tube that then in turn activates the fluorescence to put out the light for a fluorescent tube. When we're dealing with luminescence, we're dealing with a particular class of fluorescence. And when we're dealing with phosphorescence, we're dealing with a particular class of fluorescence. And those two subclasses are uniquely different. In luminescence, when the exciter excites the taggant gives off visible light. In the case of what's being done with tagging of stamps, the exciter is some sort of UV, either short wave in the United States, long wave in some other places, lights the stamp then gives off the light while it is being excited. But as soon as that exciter is turned off, then the stamp stops emitting light. Now that's luminescence. Phosphorescence works exactly the same way, except when the light source is turned off, the stamp or whatever the taggant is on, the taggant itself, will continue to give off light for some period of time. British stamps are phosphorescent, where US stamps are luminescent. So British stamps will give off light for another 1, 2, 3, some of them maybe up to 5 seconds after you turn off the light. Whereas US stamps, when the light goes off, it all goes dark. I don't know if that answered the question sufficiently or not.
Well, I'm sure we'll hear about it if it hasn't. Everyone knows they can always email at heidi@stamps.org. So if
we got 2 more weeks to tackle these again if we need to.
True that. And we can always tack on another half an hour because you are so generous with your time, Mr. Jehan. Speaking of, because you had mentioned England and the different techniques. So what other countries use luminescent tagging? Yeah, when did other countries start using the tagging process?
The simple answer is after the US did. We were first. You know, Britain gets credit for the postage stamp, but we get credit for the tagging. But it varies around the world as to when they started, how they did it, what techniques they used. And I'm not even sure I know a complete list of all the countries. I had in our third presentation, we'll talk about some of the stuff from other countries, but it's by no means a comprehensive list.
I think we have time for one more question, friends. So if you're dying to get an answer from Mr. Jehan, please use heidi@stamps.org and I will forward them to him. But as Mr. Jehan just said, it's very possible he will answer your question in the next chat. So how did you
I'll go as long as you want to.
Thank you. How did you photograph the stamps under UV?
That's the tricky one. Let me give you bring up my cheat sheet for that because I actually made it. I actually brought up a chart here. I don't know, can everybody see my slideshow if I do that?
I know I do. Yes, there it is, Mr. Jehan. Perfect.
This is an example, a photography example. Now, what I do is, in the earlier days, it was very hard to photograph color film when we're working in a film environment. But when we moved into a digital environment, that gave us some new capabilities. So I found that by using a Nikon Quick Pix camera, which is probably now 15 years old, and there's probably newer and better stuff out there, but this one worked rather well. I mounted on a tripod and I set it, I put it in manual focus, manual settings. So all my settings are done manually. I focus it on the stamp in ambient light, and then I go to a dark room by turning out the lights, and I go ahead and put the UV light on it, and then take the exposure at the widest aperture, which I think is 2.6 or whatever, and I set the timer for either 4 or 8 seconds. It takes a very long time exposure to get enough light into the camera. The eye sees, our eye is extremely sensitive, far more sensitive than any camera. So I found that I can usually get a decent picture at 4 seconds, but going to 8 seconds doesn't seem to bother it at all. It seems, I don't really get an overexposure problem. So on the left here, you have a picture of the Christmas stamp that is photographed in a totally dark room with my camera on the tripod, aimed down at it. I got I'm holding my UV light off to the side to light the tag, and I'm taking a 4-second exposure. Then the second picture, or set of pictures, where I'm showing the block of stamps, I've got the light on in the living room, which is across the hall and through an open door away. So it's the light in that room is not directly coming in. It's kind of around the corner, and that's an indirectly lit up room that then filters a little bit of light into the room. So it's light enough now that without the UV light on, I can actually make out the location of the stamps. It's really, really dim though. I put the UV light on it and I take the picture, and you can see that instead of it just getting black outside of the UV, some of that ambient light that's filtering into the room allows you to actually see the image of the stamp as well as the UV lighting up the taggant. And then I take that picture, and I found that to actually make it presentable and look good on a presentation like this, I take it into the Microsoft photo editor that comes with the photo viewer, and I just push the brightness up 50%, and there you have it. And so that's basically how I'm doing my pictures.
And thank you for that, because we received several questions regarding that topic specifically. And just as an FYI, we had an attendee that shared with us that that the iPhone works very well.
I'm sure it does. I'm sure my iPhone would really get good focus on and intensity on it. I just don't have anything to hold it on the tripod. And it definitely has to be tripod mounted or otherwise fixed. You can't take these pictures holding the camera by hand. The exposure times are just too long.
Well, on that, we could go long all afternoon with this, but we're going to have to wrap it up, friends. Again, as I said, one registration gets you into all 3 of Mr. Jehan's stamp chats on luminescent tagging. So consider yourself, in the clear. You're good to go. With that, we will conclude our stamp chat, and we thank you for your attendance and ask that you join us in thanking Mr. Henry Jehan for this great talk. Today's stamp chat was sponsored by the APS membership department. Becoming an APS member is easy, and if you join today, you get 16 months of membership for the price of 12 months. That's today only. We end today, September 11th. You use coupon code VSS2020. Visit stamps.org and apply online, and you'll have access to the American Philatelist, the APRL, Classroom C3A, and on-demand portal with lots of videos, including presentations from the virtual stamp show, discounts on expertising, and more. All ages and interest levels are encouraged to join and become a part of this 134-year-old organization. Collect, connect, join the APS. Visit stamps.org and become a member today. For more stamp chats, visit and subscribe to the APS YouTube channel, where you'll find over 60 presentations. Use the comment box below the video to keep the conversation. And yes, this video will be uploaded to YouTube. So be on the lookout. If you subscribe, you can get notifications. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next stamp chat. Until then, find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and of course, come visit us on stamps.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Jehan.
Heidi, before you make it all go away, can I